SABC News, Griselda Lewis. Good morning.
Wow, Evan, wow.
Bit of an early start for you, Griselda.
Yes.
You're almost a little bit quiet, but I want to start right at the beginning because it's been such a big news here. You know, probably the greatest story of all our lives will be, you know, the last couple of weeks. But let's just go back to almost the beginning of the year. The Oscar Pistorius scenario, I think we've got a timeline that we're going to look at. First up is the Oscar Pistorius story, and I mean, you were really quite heavily involved with it. Yeah. Just tell us about your interactions with the story and how it was covered.
Well, this is definitely a story that gripped both local and international headlines. We saw throngs of journalists descend to South Africa on the basis that we're looking at a mega superstar in South Africa, in the sporting fraternity, someone who's really put South Africa on the map, and to be accused of shooting and killing your girlfriend is a story that many journalists would be drawn to. So, you know, really gripping the headlines, still continues to do that. Even though the trial gets underway in March next year, we're looking at a situation where there's so many scandals that continue to surround this case. More recently, we're seeing the head of the crime scene from the Boschkop police station resigning, relating to the door, for example, that Oscar Pistorius shot his girlfriend Reva Steen come through on that Valentine's Day morning.
Is it true that he stored the door in his office?
That's the reports that we're getting at the moment, Eben, but you're really starting to look at a case here where there seems to be massive police bungling, because this is not the first instance that we're looking at relating to the police. You'll remember Hilton Botha, who also came under immense scrutiny during the bail application when it was found that he did not wear protective gear when he was inspecting the scene. So a lot of bungling that seems to be coming to the fore in the run-up to next year's trial when it begins, which has been set aside for 2 weeks. 107 witnesses that we're expecting to take the stand during that time. So a lot of people looking to this case to see what really happened. All of this will really come to detail when the trial does get underway next year.
And that's in March next year, is that right?
It is in March next year, correct.
It is one of those cases. I think the world will once again be watching that case. But if we can move on down our timeline, of course, we've had a new Pope. Pope Francis has been elected. You're very religious? You're Roman Catholic?
I'm not Catholic, but it doesn't mean we don't report about these things. But of course, you know, with Pope Francis, you know, with the Catholic Church and all the scandals as well that had been plaguing the Church at the time, everybody was looking to Pope Francis to see how he would deal with those particular issues, whether they'd be dealt with head on, or, as many have said, these instances have been pushed under the carpet. So with Pope Francis, we saw someone really, you'd know that he's now been named Time Magazine Person of the Year.
He's really pushed reform through in a short period.
I mean, many people looked at it as someone who's really taken the faith and put it towards poor people. And I mean, a lot of the luxuries that were associated with the previous popes, I mean, issues relating to the Pope limousine, for example, he doesn't use that. He's more outgoing, he's more open. Those are some of the things that have really drawn people to Pope Francis. And some of the surveys that we're seeing being done now recently about the numbers that are going to St. Peter's Square to listen to him when he speaks. The numbers are very immense in comparison to Pope Benedict in terms of the numbers. So, you know, someone who's really brought the church and more in terms of accessibility and what the church is expected to do, looking at the faith as a pope who really wants to deal with poor people, who wants to...
Into the 21st century a little bit. It's a real big development. Of course, then... other big story was the Battle of Bangui. Really hit home to South Africans when 13 SANDF soldiers were killed, 27 injured. What was your sort of interaction with this story? It
really came as a shock when this really did happen, because one of the main questions that was asked was, what were these soldiers doing in that part of the Central African Republic? You know, more so the scrutiny came about were these soldiers sent there, and who was the person who authorized? But it then did come into the spotlight, and clarity, in fact, that it was part of a bilateral agreement between South Africa and that country, and that they did have authorization to be in that country. But, you know, it also came to light what actually happened during that time, that they were ambushed by Seleka rebels, and that there was quite an extensive fight at the time. And these really looked at as fallen heroes in this country. They were there for peace, to secure peace and stability in that country. But unfortunately, these are the circumstances that surround it.
Yeah, it was a really big shock in March of this year when 13 SANDF soldiers. Of course, one of the other big shocks was the Boston bombings and what went on there. I think this was one that really caught America and the world a little bit off guard.
I mean, the world has always been like that following 9/11. You know, when the Boston bombings happened, I mean, in the South African context, we first start, but not that we look at the rest of the world and think we're not interested in who else has been involved in the tragedy. But in a South African context, you know, we've had more than 20 people who had registered for the Boston bombings. And I mean, the Olympians such as Renee Kalmer had been there. They told horror stories of how they'd finished the race a few minutes before they heard the bombings going off. They'd been sitting at restaurants recovering from the race that they'd completed. And this just went off, really sending shockwaves to think, is this another 9/11? What's going on? Should the world be on tenterhooks as a result of what happened at the Boston bombing? So something really, really that gripped the country, and people will continue to recover from the marathons that came after that.
Let's go back to the continent, Africa. Another big story that happened, big news here. Robert Mugabe was re-elected, and it was a little bit surprising with a sort of ease that Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF party, the level of support that they still have in Zimbabwe was quite surprising.
Look, we were in Zimbabwe for the previous election and this one. We'd been based in Harare and as well as Bulawayo and several other parts of the country. And one of the main things that we went there for was that because the previous election had been so involved, there'd been so much violence and intimidation, we would sort of expected the very same thing to happen during this election, because we could sense a lot of discomfort amongst the people of Zimbabwe. A lot of them were calling for change. They were sick and tired of the economic conditions that had been plaguing the country, but they voted.
You were based in Bulawayo, am I right?
I was at first in Harare, then in Bulawayo as well. You'd know that Bulawayo, for example, is a stronghold of the MDC, but we saw in certain parts them doing very badly, but of course maintaining that stronghold in Bulawayo. None of the violence and intimidation that you'd seen in the previous election. So an election that went very smoothly, but surprised many in terms of how the President Robert Mugabe had gone about his victory in that poll.
Of course, there were a couple of other big stories developing, but I think the Pinetown crash, of course, was another big one. I think it was really shocked people because of the video that showed how these taxis were wiped out.
Absolutely shocking to see how that truck ran through these various vehicles that had been parked and that had been waiting for the robot to turn green on the other side. Absolutely.
They were just looking at it.
Shocking. You know, so many people really calling for reform on the country's roads, saying that, you know, there needs to be more stringent measures by the Transport Ministry department to deal with such instances. And how ironic that we're in this particular time when we know that we're faced with so many accidents on the country's roads. So already then, many South Africans calling for reform on the country's roads to say more stringent measures need to be put in place to ensure that people adhere
and it's really,
to the laws.
It's really, you know, having a re-look at the business of transporting goods. And this is the video that you're looking at on screen now. That's really an horrific accident.
Shocking to look at every single time.
22 people lost their lives there. But let's move on to, of course, there was the Westgate shopping mall attack. But we're running out of time a little bit, Griselda. So I've been asked. This was, of course, in East Africa, the other big story of the year. You know, where we saw insurgents really take over the mall in Nairobi. But the big story that I want to talk to you about, of course, is the biggest story of all our times, I would think, was when Nelson Mandela passed away at the beginning of this month. And, you know, it's now past. But it's really been a worldwide played out on a global scale that I think nothing like that's been seen before.
Well, as expected, we're looking at a global icon, somebody who is revered around the world. So we're expected this kind of beautiful send-off for Nelson Mandela. And, we'd been tracking his in and out visits to the hospital. And, when the family had mentioned that, he had been very ill and that he was basically staring death in the face, that, we were expecting, if not now, that, Nelson Mandela would leave us at any particular time. But the country was never ready for that, and neither was the world. But I must commend, the SABC and many of the other broadcasters as well around the world who have really covered this story with such integrity. It's the biggest story of any journalist's career, irrespective of the experience that you have in this industry. So, a story I think that will continue. We still see stories now about Nelson Mandela and how his legacy will continue.
Just tell us, I mean, you were on the ground, you were out there, you were dealing with ordinary people. Tell us about the highlights of the 10-day mourning period while you were working on it, and what are the things that really touched you and stood out?
Definitely, I must say, my 3 days outside, the Union buildings, I'd been reporting just on the side of the amphitheatre where millions went to go and view Nelson Mandela's face, and seeing people coming from there and such emotion and such pain, I don't even know how to describe it, but seeing people expressing such emotion and, giving such a beautiful send-off to this world icon is something I think will remain with me, having to go and view his face as well, to experience. I must say, I was overcome as well with emotion, but of course we cannot show that on television. We're human beings at the end of the day, but absolutely shocking, but beautiful send-off by South Africans for a man who stood for so much for this country.
It was a time when South Africa once again came together, and only Nelson Mandela can really do this. Griselda, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Fantastic work this year. You've really set yourself apart as one of the best reporters in the country. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Eben.
That's Griselda Lewis, of course, who have covered all of the big stories in South Africa this year, giving us a unique insight into what it was like and how it affected not just her life, but all of our life. Let's now just take